You could smell the bread first. Warm, floury, crust cracked just a little from the oven's breath, the kind of smell that told you it was morning in Brooklyn, even if your eyes were still shut. The streets were mostly quiet back then, sometime around 1902, long before New York turned into a machine of sirens and metal. Back then, the horse carts still echoed off the buildings, and the air, if you could believe it, felt cleaner. A boy named Giuseppe sat behind a bread stall. Not a stall, really, just a plank of wood over two crates, with his father muttering curses in Sicilian behind him. Giuseppe Masseria, that was his name. But people didn't say it much. Not then, not yet. He watched the people walk by, their feet first, then their coats. Tall, busy men with long mustaches, women with baskets, kids yelling in a language that twisted Italian, English, and anger into one tangled song. His father always told him, "Watch their hands, not their mouths." That stuck. Even at 10, Giuseppe had sharp eyes. He didn't trust anyone. And when he smiled, it was small, like he was holding something behind his teeth, something you wouldn't want to see. That little bread stall. It was where the king first learned to count coins and lies. Years passed, so did winters. One by one, the shops changed names, people disappeared, and taller buildings swallowed the sky. By 1910, Giuseppe wasn't a boy anymore. He was called Joe now. Joe the baker's son, some said. Joe the sharp-eyed, others muttered, usually after someone owed him money and ended up with a broken wrist. But there was a shift inside him. It started small, like a hunger that never went away. Not for bread, not even for money, really. Power, that's what he wanted. Not the kind you yell about, the kind that makes people shut up the second you walk in. Joe joined up with a crew not far from the docks, small-time muscle, running protection rackets on the market stalls. He didn't say much, just watched, waited, listened. When a butcher refused to pay, Joe was the one who smashed every window on the block and left a note in blood-red paint. "This ain't your city, it's ours." That night, his boss called him in. They sat in a smoky back room where the walls sweated whiskey and old secrets. Joe didn't flinch, didn't cough, didn't ask for a chair. He just stood, hands behind his back. The man across from him lit a cigar, watched him through the flame. "You're quiet," the boss said. Joe nodded once, but dangerous. Another nod. That was the moment it started. The slow rise, the hush-hush respect. The whispered name in alleyways, Joe the Butcher, they started calling him. Not because he cut meat, but because he never left a mess. It's strange, thinking of a killer like that, standing still while the world sped up. But that was Joe. He moved when he wanted to, and only then. By 1920, he had soldiers, not friends, not partners, soldiers. They called him Boss Joe, and nobody laughed. He ran Little Italy like it was a chessboard. He didn't shout, didn't show off. He watched, listened, waited, and when someone crossed him, they disappeared. The thing was, he didn't want to share the city, and soon he wouldn't have to. But all kings start to fear the dark, even Joe Masseria, especially at night. He couldn't sleep, not well, not without something. Sometimes it was a bottle, sometimes a whisper from a girl he didn't love, but most nights it was just the click of a gun. He'd sit in a chair near the window, pistol in hand. Click, click, just the sound, just the feel, like a lullaby made of steel and nerves, because Joe knew peace was the lie, and a sleeping king was a dead one. They say power doesn't change a man, it only shows the man he always was. Joe Masseria never liked mirrors, never trusted them. Too clean, too perfect, too still. He preferred reflections in windows, blurred, shifting, honest in their own crooked way. By 1922, Joe's name was heavy. Not loud, not flashy, just heavy, like a weight you feel in your gut when you turn a dark corner and realize someone's been watching you for a while. And he had eyes everywhere now, not just in Little Italy, but up the Bronx, across the East Side, even in parts of Brooklyn where men used to spit at Sicilians like they were dirt on the boot of Manhattan. Not anymore. Joe's crew didn't need introductions. They didn't wear matching suits or big diamond rings. No. Their uniform was silence. Their badge was fear. The money came easy now. Too easy. Protection, gambling, numbers, loan sharking, all of it stacked up. The streets paid tribute in envelopes thick with crumpled green. And Joe, always the baker's son, counted every single bill like he was still behind that old bread stall. But money was just a ladder. And Joe wasn't climbing to be rich. He was climbing to rule. The old mafia, the real one, back in Sicily, they had rules, tradition, honor, structure. But in America, it was wild, raw, like a jungle with no trees, just knives and whispers in the dark. The mafia wasn't one thing in New York. It was many things. Little crews, little bosses, all biting at each other's throats like dogs starved too long. Joe Masseria didn't like chaos. He wanted a kingdom. So he started picking off rivals, quietly, strategically, not with bullets all the time, no, with dinners. He'd invite a man to his restaurant, corner table, white linen, wine poured slow like syrup. Eat, Joe would say. We're friends. And if that man ate and agreed to Joe's rules, Joe's taxes, Joe's territory, he walked out. If not, well, he still walked out. But someone else walked out behind him, and he never walked again. Joe wasn't flashy with his murders. He didn't wear blood like a badge, but it always came back to him. Somehow. Like the time Benny Luciano's uncle turned up face down in a fish stall on Grand Street. People said it was a message, but Joe never said a word. He just kept moving pieces, quiet, patient, like he was building something the city hadn't seen before, a throne. But the thing about power, you don't hold it, you borrow it, and someone's always waiting for you to drop it. By 1925, Joe had something close to an empire, and it looked like peace. But it wasn't. There were cracks in the walls, tiny ones, hairline fractures behind the marble. Men whispered about the Neapolitans, the ones who didn't bow to Sicilian rules. And then there was Salvatore d'Aquila, calling himself Boss of Bosses, a title Joe hated like poison. Salvatore was old school, cold, brutal in a way that didn't need permission. He saw Joe's rise as arrogance, an insult. And Joe? Joe saw Salvatore as an expiration date he needed to erase. The war didn't start with gunfire. It started with silence, and silence is dangerous in a city that thrives on noise. Men began disappearing, not big names, just soldiers, runners, bookies, one by one, like candles going out before a storm. Joe felt it. He always felt the shift before others did. His sleep got worse, his shoulders tighter. He started keeping a second pistol under his pillow, and a third taped under the nightstand drawer. Even his own men noticed. "You all right, boss?" one of them asked. Joe didn't look up, just answered in a voice that didn't blink. "I don't sleep. I wait." D'Aquila moved first. Took out 2 of Joe's key lieutenants in a span of 3 weeks. The bodies? One was dumped in the East River, eyes missing. The other? Found with his mouth sewn shut, a Sicilian message. He talked. Joe didn't flinch. He didn't scream, didn't throw bottles or curse at walls. He sat down, lit a cigarette, and moved 2 coins across a table. "Find me his banker," he whispered. It wasn't about killing fast. It was about killing proper. The war between Joe Masseria and Salvatore d'Aquila would paint the city in fear, and the streets would learn a new truth. Peace doesn't fall apart all at once. It crumbles in silence. During this time, Joe became more paranoid. Not foolish, just colder. His meals were pre-tasted. His drivers changed routes twice a day. He refused to sit with his back to the door. Always a wall behind him, and always, at night, the click of a gun. Click, click, just to hear it, just to know it was there. People thought he did it for comfort. But the truth? He was waiting to hear it jam, waiting to know which night would be his last. Meanwhile, new faces were rising in the shadows. A young man with ambition sharp as a blade. Charles, Lucky Luciano, once a small-time punk, now a growing storm. He respected Joe at first, but Lucky didn't believe in the old ways. He saw Joe as a wall that needed breaking. Joe saw him too, but not as a threat, more like a knife he could use before tossing away. That was his mistake. In 1928, something shifted again. The blood stopped. The air held its breath. Because Joe did it. He took out Salvatore D'Aquila. Nobody knows who pulled the trigger, but it was clean, public, final. That day, Joe Masseria declared himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. And the city? It didn't cheer. It held its breath. Because now the throne was full. But thrones are just chairs with ghosts around them. Joe's rule after that was tense. He taxed everyone hard, didn't care who you were. You paid or you bled. Some bosses paid, some plotted. And Lucky? He was watching. Because Lucky didn't want to be ruled. He wanted something else, something newer. A modern mafia where money mattered more than tradition and bullets settled votes quicker than blood oaths. Joe didn't understand that world. He was still bread and bullets, still thinking Sicilian when the streets had learned American. That was his second mistake. But even now, as cracks widened under his feet, Joe didn't run. He still sat at his corner restaurant on 2nd Avenue, still ate his bread and beans like he was nobody, still clicked his pistol 3 times before every nap. Click, 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 a sound that kept him alive and slowly made him lose his mind. Because sometimes, when the city slept, Joe could hear ghosts. The butcher with the sewn mouth, the soldiers who'd trusted him, even D'Aquila whispering something in Sicilian just behind his ear. Joe never repeated what he heard, but sometimes he woke up with his pistol pointed at the ceiling. He started sleeping less, eating slower, and he began writing little notes, names, dates, places he didn't want to forget. His men called it strategy. But it was fear, the kind of fear only kings understand. And still, outside, the streets moved on. Hustlers grew into killers, killers grew into bosses, and somewhere out there, Luciano was smiling, because the old king didn't see it yet, but the new one was already wearing his crown. Joe Masseria sat in his usual chair, same restaurant, same back wall, same napkin tucked tight into the collar of his shirt. Steam curled up from his plate, white beans, garlic, and thick, crusty bread baked just that morning. It reminded him of childhood, before the guns, before the betrayal, before he learned how to wear fear like a second skin. But even in this quiet moment, his eyes kept drifting to the door. He didn't trust peace anymore. Every time someone entered, he scanned their hands first. Were they empty? Were they too calm? Did their coat hang a little too low? That's the thing about being king. Every shadow feels personal. Every silence sounds like it's aimed at your neck. And lately, there'd been too much silence. The year was 1929. The world outside was beginning to rot from the inside out. The stock market had cracked like old glass. Men were throwing themselves from rooftops. Fortunes were turning into smoke overnight. But Joe Masseria, he still ate his beans, because crime didn't suffer in a depression. It thrived. Desperation made men reckless. And reckless men were easy to recruit, easier to dispose of. Joe's operations ran deeper than ever now. Bootlegging, numbers, smuggling, extortion. He didn't just run rackets, he ran lives. But the more ground he claimed, the more the floor shifted beneath him. Because something was changing. Not loud, not sudden, just different. Like when you hear music in a room that's supposed to be empty. Lucky Luciano had stopped calling. He hadn't vanished. No, he was still in the city, still running operations under Joe's umbrella, but he wasn't reporting in like he used to. He wasn't asking permission. Joe noticed. Of course he did. He never mentioned it to his soldiers, but his silence was sharper than any knife. He knew ambition when he saw it. He used to wear it like a jacket. What Joe didn't understand, what he refused to believe, was that times were changing faster than he was. Luciano wasn't playing by Sicilian rules anymore. He wasn't thinking about honor or bloodlines or who came from which part of Palermo. He was thinking about profits. He was thinking about alliances. He was thinking like America, And Joe was still stuck in Sicily. Joe had one weakness. He believed fear was loyalty. He thought that if a man feared you, he'd never cross you. But Lucky wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Not of Joe. Not of anyone. One afternoon, Joe called a meeting, not just with his soldiers, but with men who ran neighborhoods, bosses in their own right. He wanted to remind them who ruled the city, wanted to show that he still held the leash. The restaurant was packed, wood-paneled walls, smoke thick enough to chew. Men sat shoulder to shoulder, suits tight, faces expressionless. Joe entered last, always last. He didn't speak right away. He sat down, poured his own wine, chewed a piece of bread. Then, in a slow, deliberate voice, he said, "Some people forget where they came from. They think they built their name alone. But they forget. Someone else laid the bricks before them." Nobody responded. Nobody had to. The message was clear. He was looking right at Luciano's empty chair. Later that night, Joe didn't go home. He stayed at the restaurant, upstairs, a small room he kept with a hard mattress and a pistol under the pillow. That night, he didn't sleep at all. He sat by the window, curtain drawn back just a little. Rain tapped against the glass like fingers counting time. Click, click, click. He pulled the hammer on the pistol and let it fall soft. He always did it 3 times, not 4. 3. Something about the rhythm felt right. It reminded him that he was still alive, still here, still dangerous. But outside, in the silence of wet alleys and puddle-soaked boots, a plan was forming. And Joe wasn't part of it. Luciano had been holding secret meetings, quiet, careful, not in flashy restaurants, but in basements, garages, darkened storefronts. He brought in new names: Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Frank Costello, Jews, Irish, even Cubans. To Joe, this was blasphemy. To Luciano, it was the future. He didn't care about bloodlines. He cared about efficiency. While Joe barked about loyalty, Lucky was building a machine. And the last thing he needed was Joe. It was Frank Costello who said it first, behind a locked door in a butcher shop. "He's old, he's loud, he takes too much. We could run it smoother without him." Lucky didn't answer right away. He just stared at the floor. Then he said, "We don't kill him, we replace him." Joe could feel it in the air, like static before lightning. One of his soldiers stopped showing up. Another got picked up by police and didn't call for help. Even his consigliere, a man who'd known him since Sicily, started speaking in half sentences, eyes darting, words measured. Joe watched them all, watched and waited, because that's what he did best. Then came the final insult. Maranzano, an old boss from Sicily, newly arrived in New York, smooth, educated, slippery. He came under the guise of peace, but Joe knew better. The moment he shook Maranzano's hand, he smelled betrayal. He didn't know where it would come from, but he knew who would help deliver it. Lucky. Joe called Luciano in for a private sit-down. The room was quiet, low light, a single fan spinning lazy above their heads. Joe looked at him like a father would a son who just broke something valuable. "You got something to say to me. Say it now." Luciano didn't blink. He said, "We need change, Joe. You don't see it, but everything's shifting." Joe laughed once, short, bitter. "And you think you're the one to lead it? You think you're smarter than me?" "Not smarter, just ready." That cut deep. Joe leaned back, his voice cold. "You forget who gave you everything." "No," Lucky said. "I remember exactly who gave me everything. And I remember who keeps taking more." They stared at each other for a long moment. The air between them felt like a held breath. Then Joe waved him off. "Go." Lucky stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out. That would be the last time Joe saw him alive. Joe Masseria didn't know the exact day his death would come, but he knew it was near. He wrote 3 letters that week, one to his sister, one to his priest, and one to no one. Just a page of thoughts written in ink too smudged to read. He stopped showing up at big meetings, started eating alone. He even went to confession once, something he hadn't done in years. The priest said afterward, he didn't ask for forgiveness. He just wanted someone to know he was tired. April 15, 1931. The final meal. Joe was sitting at his favorite table at Nuova Via Tamaro, a small Italian restaurant on Coney Island. Luciano was late. On purpose, Joe had already ordered pasta, red wine, 2 cannoli waiting near the edge of the table. He looked calm, but his fingers kept twitching on the linen. Then, finally, Lucky arrived. He greeted Joe, sat, ordered nothing. They talked for a few minutes, just a few. Then Lucky excused himself to the restroom. Moments later, 4 men walked in, their faces unreadable, their coats buttoned tight. Joe didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't even move. He just stared out the window, and maybe, just maybe, he was listening for one last time. Click, click, click. The shots rang out softly, not like in the movies. No screaming, no slow motion collapse, just 4 men, 4 guns, and a quiet Italian restaurant where time froze for less than 20 seconds. Joe Masseria's body slid sideways in the chair, his head tipping back, eyes still half open, as if still trying to finish the last thing he'd been thinking. The red wine spilled across the tablecloth, slow and rich like blood itself, had been pretending to be Chianti. Outside, no one screamed. That was the thing about New York. Even murder had rhythm. The gunmen walked out calmly. No panic, no rush. They were ghosts before the cops even knew which street they were supposed to be on. And Joe? Joe sat there for another 10 minutes, eyes pointed at the ceiling, alone, heavy, still. The king was dead. But the kingdom? Oh, it was just getting started. It wasn't Lucky Luciano who pulled the trigger. That would have been too obvious, too personal. No, Luciano was too smart for that. He knew how to play the long game. How to let the final piece fall without leaving fingerprints behind. The men who fired the bullets were all trusted, all handpicked. Albert Anastasia, Bugsy Siegel, Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis. Each of them knew what that night meant. It wasn't just a hit, it was a reset. The death of Masseria was the final breath of the old world. The world of musty Sicilian codes, vendettas, and iron-fisted bosses who ruled with fear and fed off tradition. Now the streets belonged to businessmen, to architects of crime. And Luciano had the blueprints in his back pocket. The next day, the newspapers didn't know what to say. They tried. They always did. Mob boss slain in Coney Island hit. Masseria gunned down in restaurant ambush. They printed his age wrong, got the names of the witnesses wrong, said it might have been a gambling dispute. None of it mattered. The people who needed to know what happened, they already did. They didn't need ink to confirm what they had written in blood. Luciano didn't show his face for 2 days. He disappeared, like a good chess player stepping away after checkmate. Rumors flew. Was he hiding, mourning, planning? But those who knew him understood something else. He was watching who moved where, who tried to grab territory, who thought this was a power vacuum instead of a coronation, because Joe's death wasn't a beginning, it was an answer. Luciano already had plans, big ones. But before the plans came the meeting. He called them to a warehouse near the Brooklyn docks. No suits, no limos. Just plain coats, cold air, and a silent understanding. Everything was about to change. There were a dozen of them, maybe more. Young bosses, hustlers, enforcers, men who'd watched Joe rule like a storm cloud, and who now stared at each other like dogs sniffing the same bone. Luciano stood near a stack of crates, not elevated, not grand. Just there. He didn't speak for a while. Let the silence do the heavy lifting. Then he said, "What we had before, that was noise. That was pride. That was war. We're not doing that anymore." The room didn't breathe. No more one man on top. No more boss of bosses. Someone coughed. No one spoke. "From now on, we work together. Not because we love each other, but because it makes us money. Real money, quiet money, long money." He paused. "We make peace once, then we protect it like family." He took out a folded paper, unfolded it slow, read the names. 5 families, 5 chairs, 1 commission, no more coups, no more backstabs, disputes. You bring them to the table, you don't bring them to the streets. It was radical. It was brilliant. It was the first criminal democracy in America. The names on the paper would go on to define the underworld for decades. Luciano family, Charles, Lucky, Luciano, Profaci family, Joseph Profaci, Mangano family, Vincent Mangano, Galliano family, Tommy Galliano, Maranzano family, at least for now. Each one with their own territory, each one with a vote, each one with skin in the game. Luciano wasn't erasing the mafia, he was organizing it, and the only reason it was possible was because Joe Masseria was gone. In the weeks after Joe's death, something eerie happened. The streets got quieter, not safe, not soft, but calmer. No random shootings, no body dumps in the river, no messages in the mouths of corpses. Just business. The clubs stayed open. The gambling dens kept buzzing. The money moved like water through a copper pipe, and Luciano made sure the pipe never leaked. He had rules now, real ones. No hitting a made man without approval, no targeting cops unless necessary, no wars without a vote. The older bosses grumbled, sure, but even they couldn't argue with peace, not after what they'd seen in the years under Masseria. Peace made money, and money made everyone loyal, or at least quiet. But loyalty? That's always rented. And somewhere in the Bronx, Salvatore Maranzano was polishing his knives. Maranzano had pretended to support Luciano's new order. He smiled at the commission meetings, nodded during the voting, even offered to bless the families like some kind of gangster pope. But deep down, he hated what Luciano was building. To Maranzano, the mafia wasn't supposed to be democratic. It was supposed to be divine, and he saw himself as the next king, not elected, anointed. He began calling himself boss of bosses. Same title Joe had claimed, and the second Luciano heard it, he knew. History wasn't repeating itself. It was still happening. They say Luciano didn't flinch, didn't panic. He did what Joe never learned to do. He adapted. In September of 1931, just 5 months after Joe Masseria was shot dead in that quiet restaurant, Luciano ordered another hit, this time Salvatore Maranzano. But he didn't send Sicilians. He didn't use mob guys. He sent in Jewish hitmen, a crew that had no ties, no faces the guards would recognize. They walked into Maranzano's office dressed like government agents, badges, fedoras, coats, and within minutes, Maranzano was gone. 5 stab wounds, 4 bullets, 0 questions, 2 kings, dead in the same year, by the hands of the same man. Lucky Luciano wasn't just cleaning house, he was writing a new book and tearing out every page that came before him. In time, the 5 families would become legend. They'd control unions, ports, gambling, construction. They'd sit at tables with senators and burn files in FBI offices. And Luciano, he'd be remembered as the architect of modern organized crime. But deep down, he never forgot Joe, not the man himself. But the lesson: never let fear become your strategy, and never rule a kingdom you don't understand. Joe Masseria was buried quietly. No parade, no grand ceremony, just a handful of family, a few whispers. And the city barely noticed. Because the streets, they don't mourn kings. They just wait for the next one. The city didn't stop when Joe Masseria died. Taxis kept honking, trains still roared under steel bridges, and the bread in Little Italy still came out of the oven every morning, steam rising like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something big. And even if most people didn't know his name, they felt it, in the way things changed without anyone saying why. The streets got quieter, not safer, just quieter. Like when someone moves out of an apartment and you still swear you hear them walking upstairs at night. Joe was gone, but Joe hadn't left. Not really. His old crew scattered like broken glass. Some switched sides, some vanished. A few ended up face down in rivers, stabbed by friends they'd sworn loyalty to just months earlier. That's the thing with criminal empires. They don't die neatly, they don't retire. They collapse inward, All elbows and knives, no warning. Joe had built his house out of fear, and when the walls fell, there was nothing left holding it up but silence. But not everyone forgot him. Not everyone moved on. In a small corner of Brooklyn, in a third-floor walk-up above a butcher shop, Paolo Ragusa still kept Joe's photo on the wall, framed in black wood, hung right next to a yellowing newspaper clipping from 1925. The headline, "Racket Sweep Nets 4 in Downtown Sting." Joe's face was there too, smaller, younger, mouth tight like he'd just swallowed a secret. Paolo had been Joe's driver once, not for long, maybe 8 months, but long enough to know the man behind the name. He still remembered the way Joe lit his cigars, never rushed, never shared, and always flicked the match on the sole of his shoe. He remembered Joe's hands too, thick, strong, but his fingers always twitched like he was playing piano on invisible keys. And he remembered something else, something he never told anyone. Joe used to talk in his sleep, not in full words, not all the time. But some nights when the car was parked outside a meeting and Joe was dozing in the back seat, he'd murmur names, soft, broken whispers. Franco, Donato, Chi tradisce more, who betrays dies. Paolo never asked, never told, just drove. And even now, all these years later, he still had dreams where Joe sat in the back seat, one eye open, mumbling about blood and bread. Other men remembered too. Santo DiMaggio, who used to collect for Joe down on Canal Street, still cursed him in private, even after all this time. He taxed us like kings, paid us like rats, he'd spit. But he never dared say it out loud in the open, because even dead, Joe's name carried something dangerous. Meanwhile, under Luciano, the world was changing fast. The commission was meeting regularly. Rules were being written and enforced. Territories got mapped out. Profits split. And for a while, it actually worked. The chaos was tamed. The bullets stopped flying without cause. Even law enforcement noticed the shift. "It's like someone organized the animals," one NYPD captain said during a press briefing. But even as the machine hummed smoothly, there were murmurs. Some of the old-timers, the ones with creased faces and Sicilian vowels in their throat, whispered it when they were drunk. Luciano built a palace on Joe's bones. He didn't win. He inherited. Masseria. He was the last real one. And in a strange way, that sentiment began to grow. Not admiration, not forgiveness, just memory. Because Joe represented something raw, primitive, undeniable. He wasn't smart like Lucky, wasn't polished like Lansky, but he was pure power, brutal, unfiltered, territorial. And in the years that followed, as the families grew more corporate, more modern, some gangsters missed that rawness, not the blood, the certainty. Even Luciano in quiet moments felt it. One night, years later, he was sitting in a Havana nightclub, soft jazz playing, a drink in his hand, when someone asked him, "You ever think about Masseria?" Luciano didn't answer at first, just swirled the ice in his glass. Then, after a long pause, he said, "He taught me 2 things. First, never let a man control you through fear. Second, fear still works if you're willing to die with it." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. Joe's family held a quiet memorial every year, nothing big. Just a candle, a plate of beans and bread, and a prayer in Sicilian. His wife, Lucia, never remarried. She died in 1943, quietly, with rosary beads wrapped so tight around her hand, the skin turned pale beneath them. Their son, Antonio, tried to go straight, ran a shoe shop in Queens, never spoke publicly about his father, but one day, a reporter tracked him down and asked how he felt about the legacy. Antonio didn't blink. "You ever try carrying a name soaked in blood through customs?" Time moved on, and still, Joe's name kept crawling out of the cracks. In prison yards, young inmates bragged about being from the Masseria side. Old gangsters used his name like a warning, not to repeat his mistakes. But every so often, someone would look at the chaos of the modern mafia, the greed, the politics, the betrayals dressed in 3-piece suits, and they'd say, "Joe wouldn't have allowed this." And maybe that was true. Or maybe it was just nostalgia dressed up like memory. One day in the mid-1950s, the restaurant where Joe was gunned down closed for good. No big announcement, no ceremony, just locked doors and an old man sweeping the floor one last time. Before they gutted the place, a worker found something strange behind a panel in the back wall, a tiny metal box rusted shut. Inside, a pistol, old, worn, still loaded, and a note, folded once, yellowed with age. It read, "I only sleep when I know it's ready." Signed, GM. They didn't know what to do with it, so they put it in a drawer, then forgot it. That's how most legacies die, not in fire, but in dust, but not Joe's. Joe Masseria became a name that outlived his flesh. Not a hero, not even a villain, just a fact, like gravity, like rain. He was the king before kings needed votes, the butcher who made loyalty bleed, the man who couldn't sleep unless his gun whispered to him, and even as his world fell, even as younger men carved up the city like a cake, Joe's shadow still stretched across the sidewalk, long and wide. Because history isn't clean, it doesn't end with a bullet. It echoes. It started with a name, a small-time bookie in the Bronx, a kid named Carlo Trapani, 24, sharp eyes, hair always slicked back too tight. He worked the numbers quietly, stayed in his lane, never made waves. But then one night, in a cramped apartment above a laundromat, he whispered something after a fifth glass of whiskey. "You know who had it right? Masseria." He said it laughing, slurred, like it was a joke. But the next morning, someone told someone, and by the end of the week, Carlo Trapani was found in a hallway, 2 bullets in the back of the head. No note, no warning, just a message. Even years after his death, Joe Masseria's name could still get you killed, not because people loved him, because people feared what his memory could stir up. The Mafia had changed since Joe's time. Luciano's commission turned it into a business, structured, efficient, political. But deep in the bones of it, there were still men who remembered before. Old-timers with faded tattoos and gravel in their voices. Men who came from Sicilian farms where your last name was more important than your first. Men who used to bow their heads when Joe walked into a room, even if he didn't say a word. To them, Luciano's new world was too soft, too polished. Deals with Jews, deals with Irish, money going to unions, casinos, Havana nightclubs. They missed the days when things were settled with a glare and a 38. When a man like Joe could walk into a room and nobody breathed too loud. There was one man in particular who remembered it all, Gasper Gus Cavaretta. They used to call him Joe's Knife because he never missed. He had been one of Masseria's top enforcers, quiet, fast, brutal. After Joe's death, Gus vanished. Some said he ran to Canada. Others said he took a bullet to the chest and crawled off to die in the woods. But in 1935, he showed up again. Older, thinner, but his eyes, same as always. Like they'd already seen the end of the world and weren't impressed. Gus didn't make a scene, didn't call in favors. He just opened a small bar in Brooklyn, Cavaretta's near the Navy Yard, the kind of place where nobody asked questions, where the jukebox only played Italian love songs, where the back room still smelled like gun oil and forgotten plans. And slowly, men began to visit. Not many, but the right ones, the bitter ones, the passed-over ones, the ones who never quite fit into Luciano's new order. They sat in that back room with Gus, drank red wine from jelly jars, and remembered how things used to be. He never said he wanted revenge, never once mentioned Joe out loud. But on the wall, behind the bar, was a single photo. Faded, crooked, Joe Masseria, arms folded, jaw hard as brick, no frame, just taped to the wall. And that said more than words. Luciano caught wind of it, of course. Nothing moved in the city without brushing his desk. He sent a man to check it out, just to see. The guy walked into Cavaretta's, ordered a drink, nodded at Gus like they were strangers. He left 20 minutes later. By midnight, his car exploded 2 blocks from his apartment. No survivors. Luciano didn't react, didn't order retaliation, didn't send another man. He just circled a name on a folded piece of paper and tucked it back into his coat pocket. "The past wants to be worshipped," he said to Costello over dinner. "Let it kneel in the dark. That's where it belongs." But the past didn't want the dark anymore. It wanted to breathe again. By 1936, whispers of old world blood started surfacing. No one said it directly, but the signs were there. Old alliances reforming, territory disputes in places that hadn't seen trouble in years. And strange, precise murders, not messy, not loud, just deliberate. One bookie shot at close range in the spine, left kneeling in front of a meat shop. Another found in a bathtub, throat slit, the way Sicilian vendetta killings were done back home. Not across, but up to make it slower. It was ritual. It was reminder. Luciano held an emergency sit-down, not at a hotel, not at a club. In a warehouse basement, deep in the Bronx, no bodyguards, just bosses, just silence. He didn't yell, didn't bang the table. He just looked around the room and said, "This ain't a family feud. This is a ghost story. Somebody's trying to raise the dead." Nobody denied it. Nobody confirmed it either. But one of the older bosses, Don Niccolo Romano, said something strange. "You buried the king, but you didn't bury the kingdom." And that was it. That sentence floated in the room like smoke, because deep down, they all knew. Joe Masseria ruled with fear, yes. With bullets, yes. But also with something deeper. A presence. When he was alive, he cast a shadow that swallowed entire streets. Now dead, that shadow still stretched long, like the sun was stuck in the same position, never letting it fade. And some men, they liked standing in that shadow. The violence started spreading, carefully. A money runner for Luciano was shot outside a barber shop. His mouth was stuffed with a piece of bread, old school, symbolic. Then, a warehouse used by the Prohibition family caught fire. Investigators found a photograph of Masseria burned halfway through on the floor near the entrance. This wasn't just violence. It was a message. But here's the twist. Gus Cavaretta? He wasn't behind it, not directly. He had no soldiers, no crew, no plan. All he had was memory. And men who remembered with him. He didn't tell them what to do, they just did it. Because they felt like Joe Masseria was more than a man. He was an idea, a reminder of when things were simpler, clearer. When you feared one name, not five. And so by the end of 1936, Luciano faced something he hadn't expected. An uprising without a leader. A loyalty based on the bones of a dead king. He could fight it, sure. He could start pulling strings, cutting throats, sending messages. But deep down, he understood. This ain't about turf. It's about belief. And belief, that's harder to kill than any man. One night, Luciano returned to that old restaurant, the one where Joe died. It had been rebuilt. Different name now, different menu. But the booth was still there. Same spot, same corner. He sat in it, alone, ordered beans, red wine, just like Joe used to. And for the first time in years, he thought he heard something. A soft sound, a mechanical sound. Click, click, click. No one else heard it, because there was no one else there. Just lucky Luciano, and the shadow of the man he killed to become king. Luciano didn't sleep much that winter, not from fear. He told himself that often, that it wasn't fear. Just too much on his mind. Too many meetings, too many hands to shake, too many things to watch. But deep down, he knew. It started slowly, just small moments. A name whispered too carefully, a glance held too long in a restaurant, an envelope placed just a little too softly on the desk. Then the dreams. And those were always the same. A long table. Joe sitting at the far end, napkin tucked into his collar, eating beans. No words, no threats, just eating and staring, eyes steady, chewing slow. Luciano would try to talk in the dream, but his mouth wouldn't open. And Joe just kept eating. Click. Luciano would wake up in a sweat every time he heard that sound, that gun, that click. He started carrying a second piece, not because he expected trouble. That would imply someone could reach him. It was something else, a ritual. He'd sit at night in his private room above a club in Manhattan and click the slide back 3 times. just like Joe used to. Click, click, click. It helped him think, helped him remember who he was, who he had beaten, and maybe, just maybe, reminded him that nothing stays buried in this city, especially men like Joe. The streets were whispering again, not loud, not organized, just soft, almost respectful. If Masseria was still alive, Joe wouldn't have let this happen. Back then, things were cleaner. Luciano hated that most of all. Clean? Joe had ruled with knives and silence, not order. He taxed the city like it owed him rent for breathing. He killed for rumors. He trusted no one. And yet, people missed him. It made no sense. Then came the killing in Red Hook. 2 of Luciano's bookies, regular guys, picked up once a week and handed in clean envelopes. They were found in a tenement stairwell, arms tied behind their backs, throats slit clean, coins left in their mouths. Old world style, the kind of message that wasn't sent. It was whispered, and the words were simple. The king never left. Luciano wasn't the type to show nerves. But that week, his meetings ran late. He stopped taking unannounced visits, and the windows in his club office? Curtains closed, not from fear, from focus. He told himself this over and over again. But even Costello, who knew Lucky better than anyone, noticed the difference. "You look like a man counting ghosts," he said one night, pouring them both a drink. Luciano smirked, didn't answer. What could he say? That a dead man had more power now than he ever had alive? That Masseria, who couldn't adapt, couldn't evolve, was somehow becoming myth? It was Lansky who said it out loud first. "You didn't just kill a boss," he told Luciano. "You killed a tradition, and some men. They're trying to stitch it back together with blood." Luciano hated when Lansky was right. Because tradition, that was the part of the mafia he never liked. It was the reason they couldn't move faster, the reason he'd had to fight to modernize it all. The commission, the votes, the structure. Now here they were again, kneeling at the altar of a man they once feared, as if fear made him holy. Luciano called another meeting, smaller, private, just the core. Costello, Lansky, Genovese, Anastasia, Bonanno. They met in the back of a warehouse in Hell's Kitchen. No suits, no titles, just men who knew the business from the bones up. Luciano started without ceremony. "We killed a man, but not what he stood for." The room was quiet. He paced slowly, glass in hand. They're not just remembering him, they're building him, like a statue made of blood and stories. Costello leaned forward. "Then knock it down." Luciano turned. "How?" "You kill a ghost, it grows teeth." Anastasia spoke next, a man known for his rage, but this time, he was calm. "Then maybe it's not about killing. Maybe it's about something bigger." They listened. He continued. "Masseria ruled alone. That's what made him weak, but also what made him legend. No one else, just him. That's power in its purest form." Luciano raised an eyebrow. "And your point?" Anastasia shrugged. "Make a new legend, one stronger, one real, you." It sounded good, on paper, but Luciano knew better. Legends weren't made by words, they were made by dying for something, and he had no intention of dying. That night, Luciano walked alone through Little Italy. No escorts, no coat, just memory. He passed the old church where Masseria used to light candles after killings, not out of guilt, but habit. He passed the corner where Joe once strangled a man with piano wire at dusk, then sat down to eat a plate of beans like nothing had happened. He passed the old bread stall too, the place where a boy named Giuseppe Masseria once counted pennies, watching the world walk by without trusting a single footstep. The city had changed, but Joe's fingerprints were still on the walls, and for the first time, Luciano wondered, maybe killing Joe hadn't ended the old world. Maybe it had just made people miss it more. 2 weeks later, Gus Cavaretta was found dead. In his bar, head down, glass in hand. Heart attack, they said, but his body was untouched, no struggle. No wounds. And on the wall behind the bar, that photo of Joe, it had been taken down, not ripped, removed, carefully, almost respectfully. And no one knew who had done it. Luciano received no celebration, no closure. He just got a phone call from someone who said simply, "The knife is gone, but the blade is still out there." He hung up, sat down, and for the first time in years, he said the name out loud, soft, careful. Masseria. It felt strange on his tongue, heavy, like a coin pulled from deep water. That night, he pulled the pistol from his drawer, not because of fear, because of ritual. And with the lights off and the curtains drawn and the whole city breathing just below his window, he clicked it 3 times. Click, click, click. Then closed his eyes. And somewhere, in the quiet, somewhere between memory and myth, he thought he heard footsteps walking away. The city doesn't remember men like Joe Masseria the way history books remember presidents. It remembers them in pieces, in corners. In the names people stop saying out loud, in the rusted padlocks on old warehouses and the odd chill you feel when you walk past certain alleys. Joe was dead, but his reputation, that was alive, and it lived in whispers, not stories. You never heard a bartender say his name in public, but if you watched the way they looked at certain customers, how they slid drinks across the bar without charging, you'd see it, you'd feel it. It was the same in the back rooms of barber shops where old men with white combs and gold rings still talked about the king when they thought nobody was listening. He didn't ask twice. He didn't leave notes. If you were breathing the next day, you were lucky. That's how they remembered him, not for kindness, not even for brilliance, but for certainty. And in a world that was becoming messier, more political, more corporate, that kind of certainty became sacred. By 1937, nearly 6 years after Masseria's death, a new wave of gangsters had begun to rise. Most of them never met Joe, but they knew his name. Nico Spadaro was one of them, 27 years old, hands always twitching like he was holding dice that hadn't landed yet. Grew up in the Bronx, made his name hijacking liquor trucks, had a scar on his cheek he refused to explain. He was smart, in a twitchy kind of way. Smarter than most. Too smart, maybe. But he had a habit, a dangerous one. He kept talking about Joe, not in a bad way, not in a loud way either. But often enough. If Masseria was still around, we'd never have had that warehouse raid. Joe wouldn't have let the Irish take a single block of Harlem. Back then, people respected the name. Now, it's just suits talking in circles. The thing was, Nico wasn't wrong, but the commission didn't care about being wrong or right. They cared about order. And Nico, he was making the wrong kind of noise. It didn't happen all at once. First, one of his trucks got hit, cargo gone, no witnesses. Then his runner disappeared, just a kid named Leo, no body, no call. And finally, someone left a note in his mailbox, plain envelope, one line inside, "The king is dead. Long live the rules." He got the message, but instead of backing off, Nico started going deeper. He went down to Cavaretta's bar, now boarded up, and broke in one night, just to sit there, to feel it. He brought a bottle of red wine, sat in the old booth where Gus used to meet the last of Joe's loyalists, and lit a cigarette with hands that wouldn't stay still. On the wall, you could still see the spot where Masseria's photo had once been taped. There was a faint square of clean wall, just slightly brighter than the rest, like the ghost of the photo hadn't left yet. Nico stared at it for a long time, and in that silence, in that broken little bar that smelled like damp wood and old arguments, he started to understand something. Joe Masseria wasn't a man to remember. He was a question to be answered. He wasn't the only one looking for answers. Down in Manhattan, Luciano was fighting battles on every front, legal, criminal, personal. The feds were pressing harder than ever. Judges were taking bribes and still handing out convictions. Territories were shifting like sand. The commission. It worked, but barely. He'd built a machine, yes, but even machines break if too many people pull levers at once. Luciano found himself thinking about Joe more and more, about how the man ruled without committees, without votes, without alliances. He ruled like a shadow that swallowed everything it touched. And yet, Luciano knew he could never go back to that. Because Joe had ruled alone. And in this world, being alone was the same thing as being dead. One night, Luciano sat in his private study, jacket off, tie loosened. He poured a drink, didn't sip it. He took out a box from his drawer, opened it. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, faded. Joe Masseria sitting at a restaurant table. Same photo from the crime scene, just seconds before he was gunned down. Luciano stared at it for a long time. No emotion on his face, just thought. Then, for reasons he couldn't explain, he said the name out loud. Giuseppe. It didn't sound like an insult. Didn't sound like a compliment either, just real. That was what Joe had been. Not a good man, not a smart man, but a real one. And now? Luciano wasn't sure how many of those were left. Back in the Bronx, Nico Spadaro made a mistake. He started gathering the wrong kind of people. Old guys, washed-up soldiers who used to run with Masseria in the early days. Some of them had missing teeth, bad knees, lungs that rattled when they breathed. But they remembered. And Nico? He was listening. He called it the bread table, a little meeting every Thursday night in the back of a deli. They'd eat beans, drink red wine, no guns allowed, just stories. And one story kept coming up. Joe never blinked, they said that often. He could stare a priest in the eye and still pull the trigger. He once stood outside a funeral and told the widow, be grateful it was quick. He wasn't cruel. He was honest. They made him into something bigger than he ever was, something terrifying, and somehow sacred. And Nico? He believed it. That was his mistake. You don't worship old kings in front of new ones, especially not when those new kings have ears everywhere. The commission sent a message, not a bullet, not a threat, just a man, a quiet man, well-dressed, soft-spoken. He walked into the deli one Thursday, sat down at the bread table, didn't speak for 10 minutes, then said, "You're remembering a ghost. And ghosts don't run rackets." Nico looked him in the eye. Maybe they should. The man nodded, wiped his mouth with a napkin, then stood, and left. The next day, Nico was arrested. Not for racketeering, not for extortion, tax evasion, a classic. He didn't fight it, didn't talk, didn't even call a lawyer. Because he understood. The new world didn't want ghosts walking around, and he had become one. In prison, they put him in a low block. No hard time, just time. He started writing letters to no one, just pages and pages about Joe, about fear, about memory, about how power wasn't real unless people still talked about it after you were gone. He never sent them. He folded them into tiny squares and flushed them down the toilet, one by one. He didn't want to be remembered, not anymore. But someone did remember. A young guard found a scrap of paper Nico left behind when he died of pneumonia 2 years later. On it, one sentence, barely legible, smudged ink. He couldn't sleep without hearing a gun click. Now none of us can. The rain hit the pavement in long, lazy streaks. Brooklyn at night had a way of making everything feel slower, like time was heavy and tired, dragging its feet down every alley. It was 1940 now. 9 years since Joe Masseria had died with beans on his plate and bullets in his chest. 9 years since Luciano restructured the Mafia into something sleek, cooperative, modern. The world had changed. People walked faster, cars were louder, and even crime wore a sharper suit. But there were still corners of the city, crumbling, cracked, where Masseria's name didn't just live, it breathed. One of those corners was a dying bakery in the Lower East Side. They called it Paniccia's. Nobody remembered why. It had gone through 3 owners, 2 fires, and a decade of bad luck, but it stayed open. Mostly because an old woman named Zita refused to close it. Zita was in her 80s now, face like stone, hands like paper. She barely spoke English, kept a picture of the Virgin Mary above the cash register, and once threatened to beat a man with a rolling pin because he asked if she made gluten-free bread. She had one employee, A kid named Rafi, 18, Puerto Rican, smart in a quiet way. He worked the back ovens, wiped down counters, and walked the deliveries on foot even when the snow reached his knees. He didn't know who Joe Masseria was. Not really. Just a name he'd heard from the drunk men who still hung around the bakery like ghosts. One night, when the ovens were cooling and the shop was closed, Rafi asked, "Zita, who was this guy Masseria? People keep saying he used to own the streets." She didn't answer right away, just kept wiping the same counter, slow circles like she was thinking with her hands. Then finally, "He didn't own them. He scared them into silence." "That's not the same thing." Rafi nodded, but it didn't mean much to him. What did it matter now? The guy had been dead longer than Rafi had been alive. But what Rafi didn't know was that the building above the bakery used to be one of Masseria's first hideouts. Just a dusty two-room apartment with a view of the alley. He used to keep a chair by the window, same chair he'd sit in at night, gun in hand, listening to the city breathe. Click, click, click. Neighbors said they'd hear it through the walls. Just that sound. Soft, metallic, insistent, like a heartbeat made of steel. One night, Rafi went upstairs. He wasn't supposed to. The staircase was sealed with a chain, and Zita always warned him it was dangerous. Old floorboards, rats, rotted pipes. But curiosity's a louder voice than caution. He used a butter knife to pop the lock, stepped into the dark with a flashlight and a nervous laugh. The apartment was empty, dust thick as fog, wallpaper peeling in sheets. But in the far corner, near the window, there was a chair, old, wooden, one leg shorter than the others, and sitting on the windowsill, a single rusted bullet. Rafi picked it up, turned it over, and for the first time since he entered, he felt something strange. Like the room was watching him. He didn't stay long, didn't tell Zita, didn't mention it to anyone. But from that night forward, he started hearing stories differently. Every whisper about Masseria didn't sound like history anymore. It sounded like warning. Elsewhere in the city, the bosses were aging. Luciano had been forced into exile, deported to Italy in '36 after his conviction. He was still pulling strings, of course, from Naples, from Havana, wherever he could. But the streets no longer heard his footsteps, and that meant the commission had fractures again. Small ones, hairline cracks behind the smiles. Tommy Galliano, one of the more quiet bosses, began noticing a pattern. Some soldiers, mostly younger, were dropping his name less and mentioning Old Joe more, not as a threat, as a symbol. They wore Masseria like a badge, like he was something pure, a gangster before the suits and meetings and secret votes. Joe was real, one of them said during a shakedown. He didn't need a boardroom to make people vanish. The words got back to Galliano. He didn't like them. Because words like that, they meant something else was coming. The problem was, no one controlled it, not even the men whispering the name. It was an infection, not a movement, no leader, no structure, just an idea spreading through the cracks in the foundation Luciano had laid so carefully. And the idea was simple. Fear is stronger than order. In an East Harlem pool hall, a man named Vincenzo La Rosa was beaten with pool cues after saying Masseria was a coward who got soft. They didn't kill him, but they taped his mouth and left him tied to a chair in the alley. In his pocket, the police found a folded napkin with one word scribbled in pencil: respect. A few weeks later, another body turned up in Staten Island. This one was different, clean shot. Single bullet to the chest, no signs of struggle, just a napkin again. Same handwriting, same word: respect. The commission gathered in a warehouse near Jersey to discuss it. No press, no records, just 12 men in overcoats, all pretending the shadow of Masseria wasn't creeping back into their circles like water under a locked door. "We killed him," someone said. "We buried him." But silence answered louder than words, because they all felt it now. They hadn't buried the fear. They just left the gun loaded on the table, hoping no one would remember how to use it. Back at Panicha's bakery, Rafi was reading again. Old clippings, new rumors. He even bought a book from a pawn shop called Blood in the Dough, The Rise of Joe Masseria. It was full of half-truths and guesswork, but one line stuck with him. Masseria didn't die. He paused. That night, as he was closing the shop, a man walked in. Tall, quiet, dressed too well for bread. He didn't say much, just asked if the upstairs apartment was still empty. Raffi lied, said it had collapsed. No floor, no walls, nothing left. The man nodded, smiled once, then walked out. Didn't buy anything, but Raffi knew better. He locked the door behind him, turned the sign to closed, and sat in the back, hands shaking. Because that wasn't just a customer. That was a reminder that the name Masseria still carried weight, that the past was never as far away as people thought, and that some kings don't need thrones to rule. They didn't plan it. Not exactly. There was no manifesto, no signed papers, no organized revolt. But by 1941, 10 years after Joe Masseria's death, something had shifted. You could feel it in the streets if you stood still long enough, in the backs of butcher shops, in the corners of bars that smelled like old cigars and forgotten threats, in the whispers between numbers, runners, and cigarette smugglers. It was always the same tone. Things were different when Joe was around. Different didn't mean better. It meant clearer. In Harlem, 3 young soldiers from the Mangano family started wearing a red handkerchief in their inside suit pocket. Not for fashion. It was an old Masseria signal, one his lieutenants used when meeting in unfamiliar places during the late 1920s. At first, it seemed like a joke, a nod to the past, but then others started doing it. And the commission? They noticed. Not with alarms, not with sirens, but with eyes. It wasn't just a color, it was a message. We remember how fear used to feel, because in Joe's time, you didn't cross lines, you didn't take without asking, you didn't speak twice if your first answer was clear. Now, territory disputes were dragging out for weeks, bosses were being disrespected by their own soldiers, everything was too slow, too complicated. And for a new wave of gangsters, ones who didn't grow up in Sicily, didn't believe in commissions and votes, Joe Masseria became more than a name. He became an idea. In a Queens social club with no name and no liquor license, a man named Marco Di Feo started something small. He called it La Tavola Rosa, the red table. Just 5 men at first, all under 35, all frustrated. They'd meet once a week. No agenda, no titles, just stories about the past. Marco had a photo of Joe taped to the inside of his notebook, not for anyone to see, just for him. He'd open the notebook slowly before each meeting and touch the photo with 2 fingers. Then begin the talk. The city used to listen when one man spoke. Now we got 20 bosses and nobody willing to bleed. They'd nod, sip wine, listen, not like followers, like students. One night, Marco told a story no one expected. He said his grandfather used to shine shoes on Mulberry Street. Said he once shined Joe Masseria's shoes outside the church. Joe didn't speak to him, just looked down and dropped a silver dollar. Marco paused there. A silver dollar was too much, a whole day's earnings, but Joe didn't tip, he warned. They didn't understand. So Marco explained. If he gave you something, it meant you owed him, even if you didn't know why yet. That night, one of the guys at the red table left a silver dollar on the bartender's counter. Didn't say a word. The bartender nodded and locked the front door. Soon after, another body showed up in Staten Island, shot twice. Once in the back of the head, once in the kneecap. No wallet, no ID. But in his mouth, folded carefully, was a red handkerchief. The police never connected it to anything, but the commission knew. They saw the symbol, and they felt it. The past wasn't dead. It was watching. Back in Brooklyn, Raffi was changing. He'd started reading everything he could get his hands on. Old news clippings, court transcripts, underground memoirs. Zita caught him one day in the bakery basement, poring over a folder labeled Joe the Boss. She didn't yell. She just sat down beside him, wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron. Then, quietly, "You think he was special?" Raffi didn't answer. She continued. "He was a butcher with charm, that's all. You want to understand him? Don't look at his face. Look at what people became after he left. Raffi thought about that for a long time. What did people become? Smarter? Richer? Maybe, but not braver. That same week, someone broke into a courthouse archive and stole Joe Masseria's original arrest records. All of them. Misdemeanors, extortion, battery. The files were never recovered. A week later, copies of those records were found on the floor of 5 different social clubs, one in each borough. No message, just a name circled in red ink on every sheet. Giuseppe Masseria. Luciano heard about it from his contacts in Havana. By now, he was an old man, still powerful, still feared. But the world was no longer made of men like him. He sat by the ocean with his drink, listened to the waves, and thought about how everything changes, even kings, even enemies, especially enemies. He once said Joe was stuck in the past, but now the future looked more and more like Masseria's shadow. "I killed a man," he muttered one night, "but I created a martyr." He didn't regret it, but he did understand it now. The danger of a man like Joe wasn't in what he did when he was alive. It was in what people imagined he would have done if he had lived. That version, the one in their heads, he couldn't kill that one. No one could. Marco DeFeo began holding red table meetings twice a week, then 3. The group grew, 15, 20, 30, young men, middle-aged men, even a few veterans of the Luciano regime who were tired of compromise. They never called it a rebellion. They called it remembering. But remembering has a funny way of turning into action. One night, they voted. Not formally, not with ballots, just raised hands. Should they move? Should they take something? A warehouse, a dock, a corner, a test? The hands went up, not all, but enough. They called it the return. In the middle of the night, 6 of them hijacked a gambling den on the edge of Chinatown. It wasn't a Luciano property. They were smart. It belonged to a fringe crew that hadn't paid tribute in months. They didn't kill anyone, just walked in, locked the doors, took the money, and left a note. "This is Masseria's block now. Pay your respects." By morning, everyone knew, not from police reports, not from news, from the atmosphere. The city felt different again, like it had teeth. Marco knew they'd have to move carefully. They weren't building a war. They were building a memory that could bite back and bite deep. He didn't want to be king. He just wanted people to stop pretending that the current order was the only way. That compromise made strength. That silence meant peace. Joe had ruled with certainty, and in uncertain times, that was worth more than gold. In Havana, Luciano raised a glass to the ocean and said nothing. He knew it was beginning again. Not another Joe, but another era that needed someone like him. He didn't fear it. He just understood it. The king was dead. But the kingdom? It was being rebuilt, quietly, carefully, by men who never even saw his face, but still felt the echo of his voice in every command they were never brave enough to give before. The commission didn't meet for almost 4 months. Not officially. Not with the press calling it a restructuring and the agents tapping phones like piano keys. But under the silence, there was chaos. Small, yes. Hidden, definitely. But spreading. That was the danger. Not a war, not a loud revolt, just a change in mood. You'd see it in little ways. The way envelopes were handed over more slowly. The way older soldiers started showing up to collections with rosaries in their pockets again. Something they hadn't done since Masseria's time. Or the way young lieutenants started talking about rules like they were suggestions, not orders. It wasn't a rebellion, it was a reminder, and that made it harder to stop. You can kill a man. You can't kill the reason people believed in him. In a smoke-thick cafe in Hell's Kitchen, Benny Spatola, a mid-level capo, started writing down names, not for a hit list, for memory. He scribbled them on the back of old betting slips, napkins, matchbook covers, men who had once walked with Joe, men who had vanished, men who had stopped speaking Masseria's name, but never forgot how it felt to hear it. One of those names? Domenico Fabbri. Old now, half-blind, living in a nursing home in Brooklyn, pretending to be harmless. He used to be one of Masseria's most brutal collectors. They called him the Whisper, because that's all it took. One word in a debtor's ear, and the man would either pay or disappear. Benny went to see him, took 2 buses, wore plain clothes, brought a box of pastries under his arm. Domenico sat in a plastic chair, staring at a muted TV, the smell of antiseptic sharp in the air. Benny knelt down beside him and placed a small folded photo into his lap. Not a threat, just an image. Joe Masseria, sitting at his favorite table, sleeves rolled, eyes narrowed. Domenico didn't react at first. Then, he smiled. Not fully, not sweetly. Just a crooked twitch of the mouth that said one thing. I remember. Back in Queens, the red table was growing. Marco DeFeo now had chapters, one in Jersey, one in the Bronx, even whispers of one forming in Philadelphia. They weren't all loyal, but they were curious. They came for different reasons. Some wanted chaos, some wanted old-school respect, some wanted power without bureaucracy. But they all came for the same feeling, fear as authority. Marco had started changing too. He no longer laughed as easily. His suits got darker, his words fewer. He didn't claim to be a boss, never wore a ring, never let anyone call him Don. But the people in the room listened like he was one, because he didn't speak unless it mattered. And when he did, he always said the same thing before starting. We're not here for power. We're here to remember how it felt to obey someone who didn't explain himself. Then came the incident on Mott Street. A Galliano crew was running numbers out of a barbershop. Standard stuff, 5% to the bosses, clean books, until someone walked in, face covered, voice calm, and dropped a bag of cash on the counter. This week's cut, but it goes up now. The barber froze. We already pay Galliano's guys. The man tilted his head. Then tell Galliano the king came back. By morning, the cash was gone. So was the man. No name, no prints, just a note left in the cash drawer. A red handkerchief, folded, still warm. The bosses didn't know how to react, because who do you punish when the crime is a feeling? There was no faction to target, no single group to round up. The red table didn't exist on paper, no formal oath, no uniforms, no centralized leadership. It was like smoke. You could see it, smell it, choke on it, but not catch it. And the more the commission ignored it, the more dangerous it became. Because now, they looked weak. And Masseria? He looked like the man who would have crushed this the first night it happened. Down in Havana, Luciano was hearing reports. Detailed, precise. A folder arrived once a week. Clipped pages, annotated timelines, mugshots. He studied them with the patience of a surgeon. And when he reached the pages about the red table, he stopped, looked up, whispered one word. Unfinished. His assistant thought he meant the report, but Luciano was talking about Joe, about the chapter in history they had closed too fast. They buried Masseria's body, but never erased the reason people followed him. That was unfinished. In the Lower East Side, Rafi still worked at the bakery, still quiet, still cautious, but something inside him had changed. He kept going upstairs into the old apartment where Joe once lived. He'd sit in the same chair by the window, looking out at the alley. No radio, no books, just silence. He kept the rusted bullet in his pocket now, rubbed it between his fingers like a talisman. Sometimes he swore he could hear it again, that sound. Click, click, click. But he never told anyone. Because he didn't need to. One night he opened a package that arrived at the bakery's back door. No return address, no note. Just a folded piece of red cloth. Not blood, not velvet, a handkerchief. He unfolded it slowly. Inside, a silver dollar. Polished, clean. Heavy in the palm. No signature, just weight, just memory. That was the night Rafi stopped asking questions and started listening for answers. Meanwhile, Marco DeFeo called for a special gathering, not in the deli, not in the cafe. In the ruins of Cavaretta's bar. It was boarded up, rotting, unsafe. But they cleaned it, swept it, lit candles, set out chairs, not a throne, a table, with one seat left empty. No one touched it. They all knew who it was for. And Marco, he didn't sit at all. He stood behind the table, voice low. We're not here to take the city back. We're here to remind the city what happens when it forgets what fear tastes like. This isn't revenge. This is restoration." He looked at the empty chair. "We're not the king, but we don't need to be. Because the king," he tapped the table, "he still sits here." By spring of 1942, the streets were choosing sides, not with bullets, not yet, but with silence. That's always how it starts. People stop answering phones. They don't return favors. They forget to show up to meetings, and when they do, they say things like, "Back in Joe's day, this wouldn't have happened," or worse, "Joe wouldn't have asked, he would have acted." And that was the difference. Luciano's world ran on diplomacy, votes, alliances, structure. Masseria's world, it ran on instinct, pressure, precision, a whisper here, a gesture there, and most of all, presence. He didn't have to say much, because his reputation walked into the room 10 minutes before he did. The commission couldn't agree on how to respond. Some said, crack down hard, kill anyone wearing a red handkerchief, burn every last piece of Masseria's memory until even his name was a risk to speak. Others said, let it fizzle. Don't give it oxygen. It's just a phase. Kids playing soldier with ghost stories. But it wasn't fizzling. It was growing. In Newark, a small crew stopped paying street tax. They didn't announce it, didn't ask for permission. They just stopped. When word got back to the Galliano family, they sent 2 men to make the correction. Only those 2 men never came back. The next morning, their bodies were found in a car parked beneath the Pulaski Skyway. Engine running, doors locked, 2 clean shots, 1 in the throat, 1 in the heart, and on the dashboard. A red handkerchief, pressed flat, folded neatly, like it had been ironed. By the end of the week, 6 other crews started reducing payments. A silent rebellion. And when asked why, they didn't say Marco De Feo, they didn't say red table. They just said, he wouldn't have taxed this high. The king had limits. Masseria understood loyalty. Up in the Bronx, an old capo named Salvatore Sally Bags. Monticelli started holding informal meetings in his garage. He'd invite young earners and tell stories about Masseria, how he used to break up street fights by walking into the middle without saying a word, how he once stared down 3 cops outside a gambling den, lit a cigar, and walked away without handcuffs. He didn't believe in conversation, Sally said. He believed in consequence. By week's end, half those kids had taped photos of Masseria inside their wallets, tucked behind their mother's prayer cards. Meanwhile, Marco De Feo kept his distance. The more the movement spread, the less visible he became. Because Marco understood something the commission never could. This wasn't about leadership. It was about permission. He didn't want to be the next Joe Masseria. He just wanted to make it acceptable to act like him again, to stop explaining, to stop apologizing, to make the rules so simple you didn't need to ask what they were. That's what made Joe powerful. Not vision, clarity, but clarity comes at a cost. And soon, the commission started bleeding. Small stuff first, money gone missing from collections, bookies refusing new turf assignments, crews operating independently of the structure. But it wasn't chaos. It was organized disobedience. Every man who refused to listen wasn't claiming new power. He was claiming old memory. Then came the letter. Sent to 5 different bosses, no return address, no fingerprints, just a piece of cream-colored stationery typed and signed with a red stamp. The king never left. That was it. No threats, no instructions, just that sentence. And it was more terrifying than a bullet, because it meant they weren't fighting a man. They were fighting an idea. Some thought it was Marco, but others weren't sure. Because even Marco was too young to write a sentence that chilling, that precise. So they called an emergency meeting, this time in Philadelphia, hoping the distance would slow the rumors. They brought 20 trusted men. 10 of them never showed. 1 of them showed, but never spoke. Just stared at the wall like he was listening to something the rest couldn't hear. Back in New York, Raffi was changing too. The bullet he found, he now wore it on a chain, hidden under his shirt, never shown, never explained. He didn't talk much anymore. But he walked differently, like someone who understood that the past wasn't behind him anymore. It was beside him. He started closing the bakery earlier, started sitting upstairs in the old apartment more often. Some nights he'd sit by the window in the dark, just like Masseria once did. No lights, no music, just silence. And that click, that memory of a trigger being pulled over and over again. Click, 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 a lullaby for the broken city. It was Masseria's rhythm, not his rules, that people were reviving. And that rhythm was steady, uncompromising, final. Then came the night in Red Hook. 3 men entered a club controlled by the Anastasia crew. No masks, no aliases. They didn't shoot anyone, didn't take anything. They walked up to the boss at the bar, set down a silver dollar, and said one thing. The king's not asking, he's remembering. Then walked out. No one stopped them, no one could. Because in that moment, it felt true. And the scariest thing about belief, it doesn't need proof, it just needs memory. Luciano, still in exile, read the report the next day. Didn't flinch, didn't curse. He just closed the file, lit a cigarette, stared out the window at the Havana skyline and said, "It's not my city anymore." Because even though he'd built the modern mafia, he now realized something he never wanted to admit. Joe Masseria never ruled with logic. He ruled with instinct, and instinct always outlives strategy. Back in Brooklyn, the Red Table held a meeting with no speaking aloud, just a photo of Masseria placed on the table, a candle lit in front of it, and each man stood, placed a coin beside it, said nothing, sat back down. The candle flickered, not because of wind, but because even fire knows when it's not the hottest thing in the room. The commission would meet again. They'd threaten, they'd purge, they'd make examples. But it wouldn't work, because they were trying to cut off a head from a body that never needed one to begin with. The king was dead. But the kingdom? It had remembered what it felt like to obey without question. And that kind of memory? You don't erase it. You kneel to it. In mid-1942, something happened that hadn't happened in almost a decade. A crew walked away from the commission, not with a gunfight, not with a manifesto. They just stopped attending the meetings. They didn't answer calls, didn't send envelopes, didn't ask permission, and no one went after them. Because something worse than fear was happening now. Hesitation. They were a small crew based in Dyker Heights, Brooklyn. Low profile, mostly loan sharking and gambling. Nothing big. They had no name, no badge, just one thing. Every single member wore a folded red cloth in their breast pocket. And when word reached the commission that they weren't paying tribute, no one volunteered to handle it. That was the shift. Not rebellion, not chaos, avoidance, the kind that spreads like mold, slow and quiet, until you realize the entire foundation is crumbling. In a smoke-choked room in Midtown Manhattan, the remaining heads of the commission sat in stiff-backed chairs. Frank Costello, Tommy Lucchese, Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese. Luciano, still in exile, wasn't there, but his absence hung over the room like a chandelier about to fall. No one wanted to say what they all felt, so Costello said it. He's dead, and we're still scared of him. No one replied, because it was true. They weren't scared of Joe Masseria, the man. They were scared of what he had become. Marco De Feo, founder of the Red Table, hadn't been seen in weeks. Some said he'd gone into hiding. Others said he was in Sicily, digging through Masseria's family tree for forgotten names. A few claimed he was dead, and that it didn't matter, because Marco wasn't the movement anymore. He never had been. He was just the first one to light the match. Now, the fire burned without oxygen, without direction, just momentum. One night, in a small social club in Bensonhurst, something strange happened. A young soldier named Eddie Manfredi, barely 26, was caught skimming numbers money. Old rule, you get caught, you pay. And back in the day, you'd pay with your life. But this time, something different happened. The crew didn't beat him, didn't shoot him. They brought him to a basement room, sat him in a chair, set a folded red handkerchief on the table, then left him alone. For 5 hours, just him and the cloth. When they came back, he was crying, muttering, "I forgot. I forgot. I won't forget again." They let him live. Not because they were merciful, because the fear had already worked. Rafi, still working the bakery in the Lower East Side, had stopped baking. He still opened the doors, still served customers. But more and more, he was sitting upstairs in that old apartment where Masseria once sat with his pistol in hand. And the bullet still hung from Rafi's neck, still cold, still unexplained. He hadn't spoken much in weeks, but he started writing. Small things on slips of paper, folded them, slipped them into books, left them under floorboards, behind cabinets, inside the base of salt shakers, not for anyone in particular, just to leave pieces. Pieces of Joe. One note read, "A man doesn't need to be alive to make decisions." Another, "The rules are older than the men who enforce them." And another, "You never kill a king, you just lose track of his voice." Elsewhere in Brooklyn, a new term was starting to float through whispered conversations: the return. No one knew who coined it, but it carried weight. Not a war, not a coup, a reset. Back to before the commission, before compromise. Back to the moment when a man like Joe Masseria could end disputes with a stare instead of a summit. In Little Italy, a crew hijacked a protection racket from the Genovese family. They didn't do it for turf. They didn't even raise the rates. They just changed one thing. They required every shopkeeper to hang a small framed photo near the register. Joe Masseria in grainy black and white. They said it was for luck, but everyone knew what it really was: a warning. Frank Costello ordered a sit-down, private, just him and Lucchese. They met in a back office above a cigar shop, windows covered in blackout curtains. Costello poured 2 drinks, didn't speak for a while, then said, "He's everywhere, Tommy." Lucchese nodded. "But he's still dead." Costello shook his head. "Doesn't matter. These kids, these damn kids, they're not quoting Joe. They're inventing him. They're building a king out of scraps." Lucchese leaned back. "So what do we do? Burn every red rag in the city?" Costello downed his drink. "Maybe we should have burned the man when we had the chance." The commission began compiling a Masseria index, a list of known associates, sympathizers, and rumored Red Table members, but it was useless. Too many names. Too many unknowns. Too many people using Joe's name who had no personal connection at all. That was the point. The king had become faceless, which meant they couldn't shoot him again. In the Bronx, an old soldier named Giovanni Chirasso was buried. Natural causes, heart failure. But before the funeral, his family found something strange among his belongings. Not cash, not guns, a notebook, filled cover to cover with prayers. But they weren't to God, they were to Joe. Lines like, "Watch the streets while I sleep," "Silence the weak as you once did," "Guide the blade if I must strike." They buried the notebook with him, but not before one of his grandsons took a photo. That photo passed through hands like a secret handshake, passed to Newark, to Jersey City, to Chicago, because now other cities were watching. And in dark corners of dim bars, younger crews started asking, who is this guy really? How come we never learned about him properly? Why does his name feel like something we already believed before we ever heard it? That's how religion starts, not with facts, with familiar fear. At the Red Table, now operating without any clear leadership, something new happened. They brought in a chair, an old wooden one, not fancy, just like the one Joe used to sit in, and they left it empty. Every meeting, no one spoke to it, no one sat near it. But when discussions got loud or decisions uncertain, they'd all glance toward the chair and go quiet, like something might speak from it if they listened long enough. One night, someone left a silver dollar on the seat. The next night, a folded piece of red cloth. No one claimed either. But no one touched them. They just became part of the setting, like altar pieces, like relics. Then the real shift happened. Chicago called. A message sent in code through 5 different people. It was simple. We're seeing red handkerchiefs too. We want in. That changed everything. This wasn't just New York anymore. It was spreading. Because belief knows no boundaries, and a good story, once it finds ears that need it, becomes something bigger than its source. The commission couldn't stop it. Not now. Not when half the men working beneath them were whispering the name Masseria like it was both a solution and a prophecy. Not when fear had gone underground again. Not when silence had turned into obedience. Not when every decision made now carried the unspoken question, what would the king have done? He wouldn't have waited. He wouldn't have explained. He would have stood, spoken once, and the room would have gone still. Not because they agreed, but because they remembered what came next if they didn't. The first ceremony happened in secret, not in a cathedral, not in a hall, just an abandoned tenement on East 109th Street, where the wallpaper peeled like old skin and the floors creaked under every sin the city ever forgot. There were only 7 men in the room, no weapons, no titles, just one red cloth placed carefully in the center of a wooden table, and a name, Giuseppe Masseria. No one spoke for the first 10 minutes. They just stood there, heads low, breathing like the room itself was holding something heavy. Then, one by one, they stepped forward. Each man placed something small beside the cloth, a coin, a cigarette, a folded page from a ledger, a toothpick carved into the shape of a knife. They weren't offerings. They were acknowledgments, tokens of respect in a world that had forgotten what that word really meant. They didn't call it a ritual. They didn't even call it a meeting. They just called it the reminder. And by the time the candles burned out, each man had sworn nothing out loud. No oaths, no declarations. But in their silence, they all agreed on one thing. Masseria wasn't gone. He'd just been waiting. Word spread faster than smoke. Not in newspapers, not through radio, just voice to voice, palm to palm. And in each telling, the story shifted. Some said Masseria's old pistol had been found under a church pew. Others said a note was discovered behind the wallpaper in Cavaretta's bar, his final order. Wait for them to forget, then return. No one could prove any of it, but no one cared, because truth doesn't matter when the story feels more real than memory. In Hell's Kitchen, a crew pulled out of a territory deal mid-negotiation. When questioned by their boss, they said, "It didn't feel right. We couldn't picture Joe signing off on it." No one argued, because that sentence was starting to carry more weight than a gun. Would Joe allow this? That was the new question, and more often than not, the answer led to silence or retreat, because people weren't just afraid of breaking rules, they were afraid of disappointing a ghost. Marco DeFeo finally resurfaced, not in person, in message. A package delivered to a Newark cafe known to host Red Table sympathizers. Inside, a cassette tape, a red cloth, and a note that said, "Don't act like kings, act like men who remember what kings looked like." The tape was played behind locked doors that night. No one ever shared what it said. But by morning, 2 more Red Tables were confirmed. One in Buffalo, one in Pittsburgh. By week's end, 6 more. And now, it wasn't just crews. It was families. Wives, sons, daughters. People who didn't want power, just the feeling of protection Masseria's name once gave. Because during his reign, no one touched a Masseria man's home. No one messed with their kids. No one raised their voice near a woman in the king's orbit. Joe may have ruled through fear, but fear, in the right light, looked a lot like stability. At a corner store in the Bronx, an old woman slapped a soldier in the face. He was shouting at the cashier. Young girl, maybe 16. The woman stood between them, hands shaking, eyes steady. "You yell like that in my block again," she said. "I'll call Joe." The soldier laughed, but only for a second, because the girl behind the counter pulled out a silver dollar and placed it on the register. And the old woman, she lifted a red handkerchief from her purse and laid it beside it. The soldier backed away. Didn't say a word, didn't need to. Because you can break laws, but you don't break ritual. The commission was crumbling, not from assassination or war, but from irrelevance. Frank Costello tried to organize a public show of strength. Big meeting, luxury hotel, Press rumors, whispers of unification. Only 8 men showed up. And one of them left halfway through after seeing a red cloth tucked in the breast pocket of the bartender. Costello canceled the meeting, canceled the press, canceled the idea. Because you don't try to be loud when the silence is what everyone's listening to. Raffi, once just a quiet bakery worker, had become something else. He never gave speeches, never held meetings. But people started coming to him. Some brought money, some brought confessions, most brought questions. And every time he'd walk them upstairs, to the old apartment, to the chair by the window, he wouldn't speak. Just sit. Let them feel it. The dust, the quiet, the weight of the air. Some cried, some left gifts. All of them left different. One soldier later said, "It felt like walking into the beginning of something I didn't deserve to be part of." In that same apartment, Raffi started laying things out, not as a shrine, as a message, a folded note, a rusted bullet, a single coin, a red cloth stretched flat. And at the center, a photo. Joe Masseria staring straight into the camera, lips sealed, eyes unreadable. He didn't look powerful. He looked inevitable. A new phrase started appearing in letters, rumors, corners of graffiti under bridges. When the chair's full again. It wasn't clear what it meant. Some said it meant a new king would rise. Others said it meant Joe's spirit would choose someone. And a few believed it meant something darker, that the world would return to what it was before the commission, where one man ruled and ruled without mercy. Meanwhile, someone began carving Masseria's initials into benches in Manhattan parks. GM, always in the same font, same size. Always on the far right slat of the bench. The city tried painting over them. They reappeared. They tried sanding them down, still reappeared. No one was ever seen doing it. But every week, a few more benches, a few more signs. It was becoming a signature, not of a person, of a presence. Then came the day a judge received a note, typed, clean, no envelope. It was slid under his office door, sometime between dusk and night. It said, "He's watching how you sentence them. No name, no demands, just that." The judge dismissed it until his car exploded the next morning, not with him inside, with no one inside. Just gone. And in its place, a silver dollar placed where the steering wheel used to be. It wasn't just gangsters anymore. It was the city, turning, shifting, returning to something older, something simpler, not safer, just clear. Back at the abandoned building on East 109th Street, another ceremony was held. Now, over 40 men in the room, all quiet, all dressed in dark, each holding something red. They didn't speak, they didn't shout, but when the candlelight flickered just right, you could almost believe the chair at the head of the table had someone in it, sitting, watching, deciding. Because in every eye that night there was no doubt, the king had returned. And no one dared ask what he wanted, because they already knew. Loyalty, silence, and action without hesitation. Frank Costello sat at his desk in silence. The windows behind him were closed, but he could still hear the streets, the distant hum of a city that was no longer under control, though it still pretended to be. His fingers tapped the surface of the desk, slow and steady, not out of nervousness, out of calculation. He stared at the files in front of him, reports, incidents, names. One common thread tied them together. Not a crew, not a family, not even Marco DeFeo. Just a feeling. Joe. 2 more territories had stopped paying tribute that week. A Staten Island fence working under Genovese had disappeared. And in a club owned by the Mangano family, 3 men had come in wearing red cloths and left without paying. No gunfight, no screaming. They just dropped silver dollars on the table and walked out. And the bouncer? He didn't move. He watched them like a man who understood what was happening, but knew it was too late to stop it. Because this wasn't about disrespect anymore. It was about restructuring. From the inside. Costello picked up the phone and called Lucchese. "We need a meeting." Lucchese's voice came slow and tired. "No one's coming anymore." "Then we make them come." "Frank," Lucchese said after a pause, "the chairs are empty because the real one isn't." That silence again. The same one that kept creeping into rooms. The same one that made enforcers hesitate, made soldiers think twice, made men whisper before speaking. They weren't afraid of each other anymore. They were afraid of the chair. The empty chair. The one no one dared sit in. Because that seat already had a name carved into it, whether the world admitted it or not. Masseria. The red table had gone underground, completely. No more open meetings, no more visible gatherings, but the signs were everywhere. In businesses now protected by men who never gave their names. In safe houses once used by the commission, now found stripped bare, with only one thing left behind. A folded red cloth, soaked slightly at the edge, not blood, just red wine. The old king's drink. In Buffalo, a known capo was found crucified in a warehouse. No message, just a word carved into the wood behind him. Disloyal. It wasn't about money. It was about faith. And in Masseria's world, you didn't lose loyalty. You chose to forget it. And forgetting had a price. Rafi had become something else. No longer a bakery boy. No longer a curious bystander. He was now a listener. That's what the new followers called it. Someone who didn't speak often. But when he did, it felt like it came from before him. Like the words were remembered, not invented. Men came to see him, not to ask for favors, but for guidance. They sat in the old apartment upstairs, in the dark, with their hands in their laps. Rafi never told them what to do. He just pointed at the chair by the window, and they understood. Make decisions like someone's watching. Because he is. One night, a young soldier came to Rafi with a pistol. He'd been ordered to kill a former associate, a man who had been skimming from a loan racket in the Bronx. But the target was a cousin, a man who once pulled him out of jail, a man who had saved his mother's house from being burned down by local crooks. He couldn't do it. "If I don't follow orders, I'm dead," the kid said. "If I do, I'm a traitor to my blood." Rafi didn't answer. He opened a drawer and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was an old playing card, the King of Diamonds, yellowed with time, and written in ink across the card were 3 words. "You already chose." The kid cried, then nodded. He left without the gun. A week later, his capo disappeared. No body, no bullet, just gone. And from that moment on, that crew joined the Masseria side, quietly, permanently. The chair was filling, not with a man, but with weight, responsibility, expectation. It didn't matter who sat in it anymore, because the idea was already leading. The city was following something it couldn't name, but deeply feared disappointing. And the commission, they were irrelevant now. They just didn't know it yet. Frank Costello tried one last move. He called a meeting of all the bosses still willing to pick up the phone. He offered peace, a restructuring of the commission, a rotating seat of leadership, more territory, more money, fewer meetings. Only 4 showed, and 2 of them were wearing red in their pockets. One of them, a man named Angelo Pirro from the lower Bronx, stood before Costello and said, "Joe would have laughed in your face." Then walked out. The others followed. No votes, no threats, just goodbye. And that was when Costello knew. It wasn't just over. It was never coming back. Not the structure, not the rules, not the hierarchy they had built to replace Masseria. Because the new generation wasn't looking for a ladder. They were looking for a face to fear. In Sicily, Luciano heard about the meeting, and for the first time in years, he didn't respond. He stared out at the sea from his quiet villa, glass in hand, and whispered, "The boy with the bread knife was right." He meant Joe, the boy who started in a bakery, the one who learned early that you watch hands, not mouths. The one who ruled a city without ever asking for its approval. Luciano laughed once, quiet, not bitter. "We made a democracy. He made a kingdom. Guess which one survived?" Back in New York, Rafi stood in the old apartment window, looking out over the alley. He didn't speak, didn't write. He just stood. And in his pocket, he held the bullet. Still cold, still sharp. Click. He didn't pull the trigger. There was no gun anymore, but the memory of it still made the same sound in his mind. Click. A reminder, not of violence, of certainty. That night, the red tables across the East Coast lit candles. No orders were given, no messages sent, but every table lit one single candle in the center of an empty chair and left it to burn. Some for 5 minutes, some until dawn. No one spoke during the ceremony, because what could they say? The streets had already answered, the king has returned, and we are not alone anymore. No official ceremony, no coronation, no blood oath, just one quiet night in early November, when a man walked into the old bakery on Rivington Street, placed a red handkerchief on the counter and said, "He told me to come here." Raffi didn't ask who he was. He just nodded, took the cloth, and folded it into his pocket. Then he walked the man upstairs, to the old apartment, to the chair by the window. The man sat. He didn't speak. But when he left, an hour later, he didn't walk out like a visitor. He walked out like someone who had been given a command. By then, there were over 40 red tables from coast to coast: Chicago, Philly, Newark, Detroit, even whispers from New Orleans and Los Angeles. They didn't share money. They didn't hold elections. They didn't ask each other for permission. But every man who walked into a room with a red cloth in his pocket knew one thing: the king sees everything. That was enough. A young capo in Chicago, barely 30, tried to broker a deal with Cuban smugglers without red table blessing. A few days later, his second-in-command found him kneeling in the middle of an alley. Not bound, not bleeding, just kneeling. On the pavement in front of him, drawn in wine, a crown. He never stood again. No one knew what happened. He didn't speak, didn't eat, didn't blink right. But when asked who did it, he whispered, "He's not dead. You people lied." The commission no longer met. Costello had retreated into a hotel suite uptown, surrounded by men with guns and eyes full of nothing. Lucchese refused interviews. Anastasia spent his last days watching doors instead of sitting at tables. Even Vito Genovese, the man who once believed he'd rule it all, was seen praying at St. Patrick's one morning, gripping a coin between his fingers like it was a relic. He left it in the offering box with a note inside. "Forgive us. We tried to build a world without fear." Meanwhile, Raffi no longer served pastries. The bakery was open, but no bread came out of the oven. People came in for something else. They came to stand near the counter, to say nothing, to nod once and leave. Each visitor different, young, old, suited, bloodstained. But all of them knew they were walking into a place that wasn't about food anymore. It was a doorway, not to power, not to salvation, but to something more dangerous, to permission. One evening, a man left behind an envelope on the counter. No return name, no message. Inside, Raffi found a photograph. It showed the inside of a federal court. 5 men sitting at a table. One of them, a prosecutor, had a red thread sticking out of his pocket. Raffi smiled for the first time in weeks. The message was clear. The reach had extended. Back in Harlem, the original red table, Marco De Feo's table, was now a memory. But the building that held it still stood, vacant, abandoned, crumbling. Until one day, passers-by noticed something new. A door that never stayed closed, a single chair in the middle of the room, a candle always lit, and beside it, a folded cloth and a coin. Some said you could walk in, sit, and feel something, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to you. The city had changed, not through revolution, through ritual. The streets no longer belonged to the highest bidder or the smartest strategist. They belonged to the one name no one dared say lightly: Masseria. He had become more than myth, more than fear. He had become standard. His name wasn't said with nostalgia anymore. It was said with discipline. Would Joe tolerate this? Joe wouldn't let this stand. This wouldn't have happened under the king. These weren't questions. They were verdicts. A new rule began appearing at red tables. One chair must always be empty. It wasn't superstition. It was design. That chair wasn't waiting to be filled. It already was, by presence, by legend, by law. On a fog-soaked night in early December, a young enforcer was caught pocketing half a gambling hall. The old punishment would have been death, but things were different now. He was brought before the red table in Newark. No guns, no screaming, just a question. Did you forget who watches you? The man wept, not out of guilt, but because he realized the answer was yes, and that kind of forgetting. It was worse than death. They let him live, but not untouched. His pinky finger was broken in 3 places. He was ordered to carry a silver dollar between the cracks of the splint for a year, so that every time he moved his hand, it would remind him, you never act alone, not when the dead are watching. Rafi, now known only as the Watchman among those who whispered, no longer left the apartment. People brought him news, letters, tokens. They never stayed long, because staying too long near the presence made people uneasy, not scared, just aware of how little their lives were compared to the memory that now ruled them. One night, he received a package wrapped in black cloth, inside a bottle of red wine, dust-covered and uncorked, and a note from Havana. The last one who tried to stop the king sends his respects. There was no signature, but Rafi knew. Luciano. The last to stand against Joe and live long enough to regret it. The bottle was never opened. It sat by the window, beside the bullet, beside the chair, waiting, just like everything else. Because the world didn't belong to the living anymore. Not in that corner of the city, not in those alleys, those tables, those eyes. It belonged to the idea of one man who never apologized for what he took. Joe Masseria never came back from the grave. He didn't need to. He never left. Because fear, when wrapped in respect, becomes something eternal. Not a dictatorship, a belief. The throne wasn't rebuilt. It didn't need to be. Because every chair left empty in his name was already full.